Welcome to Osborne Clarke's Building Safety video series, in which experts from across the firm will be unpacking key aspects of the bill, which is currently going through Parliament. My name is Rebecca Francis, and I'm in the Real Estate Disputes and Risk team, and I'm joined by Matthew Carl, who's in the Regulatory Disputes team. Today, I'm going to be asking him about what's in the Building Safety Bill and who it applies to. Matt, hello.
Hello.
So the government rhetoric is very much that the Building Safety Bill will bring about the biggest changes to building safety in decades. But what is it all about?
Well, I think for once this isn't one of the government's exaggerations that is untrue. It really is a real change in the whole regime for building safety and building control. The focus, I think, as probably many people know, is on high-rise buildings. It's going to affect the way they're designed, the way they're built, managed and lived in. And also the idea is to create this single regulatory regime which will have a lot more scrutiny powers backed up by some quite serious enforcement, some criminal sanctions for those that are unable to demonstrate compliance with the new obligations that come under the bill. So quite an onerous and far-reaching piece of legislation.
So as you said, I mean, it's onerous and far-reaching, but it's also substantial in size as well. What would you say are the sort of main components of the bill?
Well, although it changes a lot to do with building control, frankly, a lot of that detail is still slightly to come. The main focus is on high-risk buildings, which have been defined as high-rise residential buildings, hospitals and care homes, which are over 7 stories, at least 7 stories tall or 18 metres in height. I think probably what will be interesting to look at where this goes is how that category and that definition may well expand to perhaps bring in other buildings, either of a lower height or different use buildings where people are sleeping overnight, potentially, such as hotels. And also, I really think that the way in which it will influence perhaps buildings below that height, because once you start to set a standard, particularly with the parts of the bill that are making residents' voices very prominent in this and a lot of resident engagement, you can see that there'll be some pressure there to actually implement some aspects of this bill, as I say, in a wider category of building, not just those that are currently defined as high risk. So that's part of it. And also there is the creation of these new duty holders, which we'll come on to in a subsequent video, but those new duty holders will have responsibilities for the building once it's in occupation, an ongoing duty to manage the safety of that building again, and there's some quite onerous obligations in respect of those duty holders. And also the other thing it's doing is to set up a construction products regulator, really to tighten up on some of the testing of products that are used, so that there's perhaps greater transparency and a greater consistency. One of the things that was found in Grenfell was that there was some confusion over how things were being tested, what was safe, what rating things had, and I expect all that will be tightened up through this regulator. And I mean, sitting above that is the building safety regulator, who will be tasked with enforcing this piece of legislation. So it's really something that's going to cover design, development, and occupation of those buildings in scope. So, as I say, quite a wide effect. And when I talk about design, development and occupation and the building safety regulator, that will involve passing through 3 distinct gateways. So a planning gateway, the actual design, and then and construction, and then through to occupation. And those gateways really are quite key, I think, and will make quite a marked change in the way in which buildings of this nature are currently developed and constructed.
So you obviously mentioned these gateways. Are you able to explain a bit more about them and what they're?
Yeah, well, really they're about evidencing, putting it simply, evidencing the building is safe, but you have to get it past the building safety regulator, if you like. They're the gatekeeper. So the first gateway, which is actually already in force, which is a planning gateway, where one of the main things you have to produce is a fire safety statement, and that's to do with the land use around your development and how that how you will evidence that doesn't affect fire safety, and you've thought about the various risks. It could be things like emergency access, for instance, but that's part of it. Some of that's quite detailed already, so you're already thinking at a very early stage in more detail perhaps than before about fire safety, general building safety. And then the other part to that is that in that first gateway, the idea is that the health and safety executive will be much more involved in that sort of planning process and have much more of a say in what's happening. So it's really a tightening up of that part with a huge, obviously huge safety slant to those planning aspects which are already in place. Gateway 2 is really about the construction. It's about demonstrating that the way in which the building is going to be designed and constructed will be compliant with building regulations, and that you can demonstrate that it's going to be safe. And one of the issues quite often is actually being able to demonstrate it's being constructed to the design, and things haven't changed. But again, this will involve reporting information through to the building safety regulator. And there's a hard stop on this gateway, as there is on the next gateway, in terms of the building safety regulator being able to say, well, I'm not satisfied. I either need more information or you can't do this. So it's going to have a real impact on the way things are done. And then gateway 3, well, that's really like your practical completion sort of certificate. It's about being able to justify that the building is then fit for occupation. And it should really be a drawing together of the various strands that you've already got of information to present a safety case really to the building safety regulator, something again that we'll come on to because that's quite a detailed aspect in one of the other videos. But that will be effectively the sign-off part. So it's very important that in order to get that, and occupation and practical completion, clearly a huge trigger point in any development, is to ensure that you have all of your information there, and you're quite able to evidence it to the building safety regulator, so there's not that sort of last hold up at the end.
So obviously there is going to be a lot to digest in this bill. When is it expected to come into force?
I think probably late 2022, probably, or early 23. It's at the moment it's in the committee stage, so it is subject to change and has been already changed between the first and second draft. But I think we can expect it then. There is also a raft of secondary legislation, which may or may not come out at the same time. So it is a little way off. But in effect, I think that probably the thing to think about is actually as this new benchmark, if you like, starts to be set through this legislation, then almost regardless of the pace that it takes to get the law in effect, there's going to be some commercial pressure and pressure from residents really to start driving up those standards. So I think potentially, whilst it might not be the law, you will be able to see that things are already changing and already have to be thought about.
In terms of existing high-rise buildings which are in scope and occupied, how will the bill apply to those buildings?
Well, obviously they've already been built and occupied, so you've not got gateways 1 and 2, the planning, design, construction, but they still have to demonstrate that they are safe for that continued occupation. So they will still need an accountable person. This is one of the new roles I spoke about, and we'll come on to that in another video, and a building safety manager, and they'll still have a responsibility for managing and demonstrating how they're managing the safety of that building, and part of that is putting forward a safety case to the building safety regulator for that occupation. So they are still affected. I think there'll be a slight difference in how they're dealt with, not least because they're going to have the challenge of very historic information and potentially information that's incomplete or not held digitally, which is going to be one of the, I think is going to be one of the requirements in terms of this safety information. So it is quite challenging. I suspect where the building safety regulator may come from is to really look at how they're actually managing almost the day-to-day things. So actually how they're reviewing the various passive and other fire measures, so the proactive fire measures are alarms, sprinklers, fire doors, that sort of thing, as well as the behaviour of the people and people that use the buildings. So I think there'll be a little bit of lenience perhaps in terms of that, but yeah, you don't escape it just because your building has already been built. So it's important again to think about how you're going to pull that information together.
So who will the bill ultimately apply to?
Well, as we said, it's going to be owners, developers, really all those in the built environment industry. So those who commission the work, commission the buildings, design, construct. But I think apart from that, just simply because of the effects on this and the criminal sanctions and the degree of scrutiny, you can also be looking at much wider than that. So investors, freeholders, the insurance market. Really, I think the cost of perhaps both complying with this and also the scrutiny that it brings to buildings which may then have to be brought up to standard, and the cost that's involved in that is going to really pique the interest of all those who have an interest in a particular building.
So there's obviously a lot to digest here. When are we expecting the bill to come into force?
Well, it's in the committee stage at the moment in Parliament, so it's subject to change, and there's been already a change between the first and second draft. But when it actually becomes law, possibly back end of 2022, first quarter of 2023, it's quite difficult to predict, and there's a raft of secondary legislation that comes in as well. So we're still trying to grasp a bit more detail, but yeah, I suspect it's a little way off at the moment. But that said, I can see already changes within industry in the way in which people are looking at things, and perhaps the demands of those on the other end, so the residents, insurers, etc., to actually start to get together some of the standards and requirements that are in the bill and start to apply them now. All right, not a legal pressure, but if you like, a commercial pressure. So I think things will be changing. It won't just wait for the law to come into force.
So finally, and in a similar vein then, in terms of those who are going to be impacted by this bill, what should they be considering now?
Well, I think the first point is just a realisation that greater scrutiny is coming, and there's a significant change. You then have to say, well, how do we fit into that? So are we going to be responsible for some of these new roles, accountable person, building safety manager? How might that work? You need to be thinking much more about how, if you're developing something, how you keep your designers engaged, perhaps much closer to the construction as it goes through, because they'll be required to input, and that information will all have to be tied together. Declarations to say it's been done in compliance with building safety regulations, etc. So that sort of information piece and working close together, I think, is going to be a bit of a step change to where it might have been before. I think you have to be prepared there's going to be, unfortunately, some added cost and some delay, not least getting through a building safety regulator who I suspect is going to be fairly overwhelmed with work. And as it starts to find its sort of bearings and we understand what information has to go in and what's acceptable, I think there's inevitably going to be some delay, therefore some costs. So again, who's going to absorb those costs? Where are they going to go? And for any building that it becomes in scope which needs remedial works, again, a lot has been said about this, but also thinking about who's likely to pay for those costs. And I suppose attached to all that, it's looking at how you're forming your contracts in terms of indemnities, insurance, that side of things. But I suppose overall, it's really about the quality of the information. So if you're already starting to design and develop something, you have to think about that end goal of, well, this information has to be of a good enough quality and standard and comprehensive enough to satisfy the production of a building safety case. That's where you're going to draw all that data from. So if you are not on top of that and in control of that, then you really are storing up problems for later on, because you just won't be able to evidence that you've complied with it. So I'm afraid it's quite onerous, but it's a slightly watch this space to see how the detail and guidance comes out.
And get your lawyers involved.
Absolutely.
As soon as possible.
Yes, absolutely.
Thanks very much, Matt.
Okay.
In our next video, Matt is going to be looking at the new duty holders set out in the bill, and the videos will be accompanied by insight briefing notes as well. Thanks very much.
Thank you.